Hi everyone, welcome to today's quarantine clinic. Today we'll be discussing about brainstem strokes, and the first half an hour of the discussion will be entirely on anatomy, and we'll give you an idea of what structures are there in the brainstem, and the next half we will talk about what will happen if there is a lesion in any one of these areas. So the key to understanding brainstem stroke is having a good knowledge of neuroanatomy. Actually, the key to understanding all of neurology is having a good understanding of neuroanatomy. So let's begin. So right from the basics, what is the brainstem? The brainstem is the part of the neuroanatomy that connects the brain and the spinal cord. So the brainstem has basically three parts. You have the midbrain, you have the pons, and you have the medulla. Okay, and from an embryological perspective, like a quick revision of the embryology, you have when the fetus is developing, you have the prosencephalon, you have the mesencephalon, and you have the rhombencephalon. So the prosencephalon will have the telencephalon and the diencephalon, and both the telencephalon and the diencephalon will end up forming the cortex and the subcortex till the part of the thalamus and hypothalamus. And the brainstem downwards is from the mesencephalon. So the mesencephalon will form the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon will have two parts, that is metencephalon and myelencephalon. So the metencephalon will form the pons and the cerebellum, and the myelencephalon will form the medulla and the spinal cord also. So this is the rough structure. So we are essentially interested in everything below this. So we want to know this part of the neuroanatomy. Now the interesting thing is that in each one of these areas, in each one of these different parts of the neuroanatomy, you have a different CSF space. So since we have reached here, I'll just tell you, in telencephalon, you have the lateral ventricles. In the diencephalon, you have the third ventricle. In the midbrain, you have the cerebral aqueduct, and the pons, you have the fourth ventricle. And then in the spinal cord, you have the central canal. In the medulla also, you have the central canal. So this is the rough neuroanatomy and the overall structure of the brainstem. Now let us take a closer look. So now I'm drawing the brainstem in much larger dimension. So when you think about the brainstem, there are certain factors that you need to think of. One is that there are tracts. So tracts are white matter fibers connecting the brain and the spinal cord. So there are tracts that pass through the brainstem, either going down or going up. So tracts can be ascending or descending. And descending tracts, meaning tracts coming from the cortex to the spinal cord, are motor, and ascending tracts, so tracts going from the spinal cord to the brain, are sensory. So this much is logical. What else can be there in the brainstem? You can have your cranial nerve, nuclei, and nerves. So your cranial nerve, nuclei, and nerves are scattered across the brainstem. So we'll get to where and what is there. But for now, just remember there are tracts, ascending, descending, and there are cranial nerve nuclei, and there are cranial nerve nerves. What else can be there? So right behind the brainstem, around the around the pons is the cerebellum. Okay, and these cerebellum fibers have to talk to both the cortex and the spinal cord. So all these connections will be going through the brainstem. So the third thing that will be there in the brainstem is the cerebellar connections. What else is there in the brainstem? You know that your brainstem controls all your primary functions of the body, such as respiration, your cardiac cycle. Even when you're walking, that gait is controlled in your brainstem. So there is a term for this, which is called central pattern generators. So these are called CPG. So all of these are in the brainstem. And finally, you have your modulatory centers. So when I say modulatory centers, I mean your the centers that control all your hormones. So you have your locus coeruleus, your raphe nucleus, and substantia nigra. So these are all different centers in the brainstem that control your limbic system and your cortex. So they release norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. So these are the overall structures in the brainstem. So if there is a brainstem lesion, any one of these may be affected. Okay. So for today's discussion, we are going to be talking mainly about the tracts and the cranial nerve nuclei, and to some extent the cerebellar connections. We are not going to be talking about the uh, central pattern generators or the medullary centers, but it is important for you to remember that these are also there and they can also get affected. Now, let us take these three things one by one. Let us look at tracts. So what can be the tracts that are going through the brainstem? And let's take the two types of tracts separately. So let's take the motor tracts first. So the motor tracts meaning the descending tract. And today, the main descending tract that we will discuss is the pyramidal one. There is also extrapyramidal tracts, but today we are not going to discuss that in too much detail. We'll discuss the pyramidal tract, which is also known as the corticospinal. And your sensory tracts, that is your ascending tracts. There are two main sensory ascending tracts. One is, if you remember from our spinal cord discussion, you have ascending tracts called lateral spinothalamic, which carries your pain and temperature. And you have a dorsal column, which carries pressure and vibration. Now, the lateral spinothalamic tract crosses over at the brainstem level itself and then ascends up, whereas the posterior column fibers will ascend up on the same side and then cross over in the lower, no, sorry, in the middle medulla. So it crosses over in the medulla basically. And so at the medullary level, these two will sort of come together. Okay, so the two main ascending tracts is your posterior column and your lateral spinothalamic. So this leaves us with three basic tracts to discuss. One is the descending pyramidal tract, one is the ascending posterior column, and one is the ascending lateral spinothalamic, or rather the spinothalamic tracts. Okay, so now let's look at the pyramidal tract first. What happens with the pyramidal tract? The pyramidal tract emerges from the motor cortex, comes down the cortex, enters the internal capsule, becomes like a tight band. So initially it is all diffused fibers. After the internal capsule, it becomes one tight band and it descends down, and it descends in the anterior part of the brainstem. Okay, so now let me draw this in another color. It descends down the anterior part of the brainstem. And this is important for you to know. So the anterior part is also known as the ventral part, and the ventral part is predominantly motor. And the posterior part is known as the dorsal part, and the dorsal part is predominantly sensory. So this is a good thing to remember, because at any point, if you take a cross section, you might be confused as to, is this anterior or is this posterior? So in general, whenever you see the motor tract, so whenever you see the corticospinal tract, that is the anterior part. And all the sensory stuff is arranged in the posterior part of the brainstem. So, right, so that is how the pyramidal tract comes down. What about your lateral spinothalamic? Now your lateral spinothalamic comes up the spinal cord and then ascends up the posterior part of the brainstem and then terminates in the thalamus. So the thalamus is here, and there is a part in the thalamus. There is a nucleus in the thalamus known as ventro-posterolateral nucleus. So the spinothalamic tract ends up in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. We won't discuss thalamus in detail today, but just remember VPL is where the spinothalamic tract ends up. And conveniently enough, VPL is also where the posterior column ends up. So the posterior column ascends in the back of the spinal cord because it is called posterior. And then at the midbrain, it will cross over to the opposite side and then ascend up and sort of merge with the spinothalamic tract and then end up in the same VPL. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Your VPL now has the sensory supply to your opposite side of the body, both from the spinothalamic tract, which crossed over at the spinal level itself, and your dorsal column, which crossed over at the medullary level. Okay. And when I discuss the pyramidal tract, coming down, I should have shown that at the lower end of the medulla, the pyramidal tract also crosses over and descends. Okay, now it looks perfect. This is how the three tracts are, how these three tracts travel in the brainstem. Now let us take a cross section at each one of the three areas, midbrain, pons, and medulla, and look at where these three tracts will be. So this is midbrain, this is pons, and this is medulla. Now I'm going to draw this is anterior and this is posterior. Okay, so this is ventral and this is dorsal. Okay, now this okay, so let us look at first the pyramidal tracts. So the pyramidal tract is supposed to be anterior. So in the midbrain, the pyramidal tract will be most anterior. In the pons also it will be anterior, and in the medulla also it will be anterior. Now, what about the lateral spinothalamic, which are shown in orange? So in the lateral spinothalamic, it will be, obviously, as the name suggests, it will be lateral, and it will be lateral in all three. Now, what about the posterior column, which I had shown in green. Now the posterior column is interesting because as it is ascending up, initially in the medulla, it will be separate. Then in the medulla, they start to cross over, because remember that the posterior column has not crossed over in the spinal cord. So they start crossing over in the medulla. They form something known as medial lemniscus, and that medial lemniscus starts going backwards and laterally until they sort of merge in with the lateral spinothalamic. So as you go up the brainstem, the posterior column fibers cross over in the medulla and then go laterally and join the spinothalamic tract, which is lateral. And then they will end up in the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. Okay. So this is the basic anatomy of how the tracts go. Now you can imagine that if there is a lesion, if there is a stroke in the anterior part, that is in the ventral part of any one of these three areas, you will have a pyramidal tract lesion. And if there is a lesion in the dorsal part, then you will have a sensory lesion. Okay. And conversely, if you have a lesion only on one side, now you can imagine this is very similar to the Brown-Sequard syndrome that we discussed in the spinal cord. So you will have a contralateral hemiparesis, and depending on where is the lesion, whether the posterior column has crossed or not, you will have contralateral spinothalamic tract problem and contralateral posterior column problem. Okay, so that is it with the tracts. Now, what else is there in the brainstem? You have your cranial nerve nuclei. So now let's discuss where the cranial nerve nuclei are distributed. So you have 12 cranial nerves. Your cranial nerve 1 and 2 arise before you reach the brainstem. From the brainstem onwards, you have 3 and 4 in the midbrain, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the pons, and 9, 10, 11, and 12 in the medulla. Okay. And usefully enough, all of them are at the back of the brainstem. So that is the dorsal part of the brainstem. And roughly all of them are in the midline. Okay. And some of the fibers leave from the midline and some of the fibers will leave from the sides. And this is where the confusion can happen. So if there is a midline stroke, the fiber may get affected. If there's a lateral stroke, some other fibers may get affected, but the nuclei are mostly all at the back and all in the center. Now let's take it one by one. So now let's take the midbrain. We've already done half. So let's take this example of the midbrain. So here the third nerve nuclei are here, and the fourth nerve nuclei are a little ahead. Okay. So this is how the third nerve nucleus is there, and the third nerve fibers will leave like this. So it will leave anteriorly. So you have third and fourth. What about in the pons? So in the pons, your fifth, sixth, so your fifth nucleus is sort of distributed throughout the brainstem. So from the pons up till the medulla, your fifth nucleus has 4 nuclei. Fifth nerve, cranial nerve, has 4 nuclei. So they are spread across the brainstem. But we will take sixth and seventh, your sixth and seventh nuclei, And the way they are arranged is, if these are the pyramidal tracts, they are arranged posteriorly. So this is your sixth nerve nucleus, and this is your seventh nerve nucleus. But the interesting thing is that your sixth nerve nucleus will, the nerve sort of comes out like this, but let me just clean up this part. Okay. Your sixth nerve nucleus, the nerve will come out straight ahead, but the seventh nerve nucleus will sort of loop around the sixth nerve nucleus, and it will form a bulge behind, which is known as the facial colliculus. So the facial colliculus actually has the seventh nerve plus the sixth nucleus. So that's just an extra information. But this is how the sixth and seventh nerve nucleus is arranged in the pons. And the eighth nerve is somewhere here, eighth nerve nucleus. And in the medulla, your 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, we'll mainly take the 10th and the 12th. So your 10th nucleus is here, your 12th nucleus is here, and the 12th, the 10th nucleus, the nerve leaves directly lateral, and the 12th nucleus leaves like this. Now, why is this important? Because supposing if there is a lateral lesion, your 10th nerve will get involved, and suppose there is a medial lesion, your 12th nerve will get involved. So we'll discuss this later, but roughly this is the distribution of your cranial nerve nuclei across the brainstem. Now, what else is there in the brainstem? You have your cerebellar connections. So regarding your cerebellar connection, I just want to give you a brief idea that your cerebellum is arranged posterior to the brainstem, and all the connections of the cerebellum will enter in and exit out through these three gates known as peduncles. So you have a superior cerebellar peduncle, a middle cerebellar peduncle, and an inferior cerebellar peduncle. And roughly they correspond to the three parts of the brainstem. So the middle cerebellar peduncle talks with the pons, the inferior cerebellar talks with the medulla, and the superior cerebellar talks with the midbrain. Okay, so roughly you can imagine that if there is a midbrain stroke, you can have superior cerebellar peduncle involvement. Pons stroke, you can have middle cerebellar, and medullary stroke, you can have an inferior cerebellar peduncle involvement. So that is the rough outline of how the neuroanatomical structures are distributed. Now, before we go into what will happen if there are different lesions in the brainstem, you need to have an idea of how the blood supply to the brainstem happens. So for this, you need to know about the blood supply to the brain. We had already discussed this a little bit before when we talked about hemiparesis, but roughly there is an anterior circulation and a posterior circulation. So for the brainstem, the anterior circulation is not important, the posterior circulation is important. So in the posterior circulation, you have two vertebral arteries arising from the subclavian artery on either side. It will ascend up the brainstem. It will join together, form something known as basilar artery. And the basilar artery will go up and then split into posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery. Okay, and this is the vertebral artery comes together to form the basilar artery at the level of the pons, and the basilar artery splits into the posterior cerebral arteries at the level of upper midbrain. Now, why is this important? Because your medulla, so if you take it one by one, your medulla is supplied by your vertebral artery, your pons is supplied by the basilar, and your midbrain is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Now, this is a rough outline, but this is what you need to remember. So if there is a vertebral artery problem, your medulla will get involved. If there is a basilar artery problem, your pons will get involved. And if there is a PCA problem, then your midbrain will get involved. Okay. Now let's come to what happens if there is a lesion. So let's go above downwards. Let's take midbrain strokes first. Now, in the midbrain, we've already seen how there is the corticospinal tracts. So they're also called as cerebral peduncles. So there are two cerebral peduncles. So these are the corticospinal tracts that haven't crossed yet. So they cross at the lower part of the medulla. So in the midbrain, they haven't crossed yet. And right behind that, there is something known as substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. And right behind that, there are two structures known as red nucleus. Okay. And then we come to our third cranial nerve nuclei. And laterally, you already know, we have our sensory tracts, ascending sensory tracts. And posteriorly, there is an interesting thing known as colliculi. Now, why is this interesting? So this is at the posterior part of the midbrain, and there are two colliculi, one above and one below. The superior one is called the superior colliculi, and the inferior one is called the inferior colliculi. And the function of the colliculi is to turn your head, your neck, and your eyes to any stimuli. So if something suddenly makes a noise on your right side, you immediately look towards the right. If there is a firecracker that goes on your right side, you'll immediately look to the right. If there is a sudden flash of light on your right side, you'll immediately look to the right. Now, think about all the things that would have happened for you to quickly turn your head, you turn your eyes, turn your neck, turn your body to the right. That entire thing happens in this area. So your superior colliculus will respond to sight, that is, it will respond to light. So everything that you see, your superior colliculus responds, and your inferior colliculus responds to sound. So everything you hear, your inferior colliculus responds. And this entire part together is known as tectum. So tectum is the part of the midbrain that is responsible for turning head to stimuli. So anytime you hear the word tectal, so you can hear tectospinal or spinotectal. What that means is that there is information going from and coming to this part that is somehow responsible for turning your head towards a threat. Okay, so that is why this is interesting. Uh, okay, now coming back to the site of lesion. Okay, so here there can be multiple lesions that can happen. Remember that your cranial nerve 3 nuclei, the fibers are exiting like this. So now where can the lesions be? There could be a lesion here. Sorry, that I drew that too big. Okay, there could be a lesion here. So if there is a lesion, we'll call this lesion 1. So in lesion 1, what are the areas involved and what is the effect? So in lesion 1, the areas involved are your corticospinal tract and your cranial nerve, third cranial nerve. So then what will happen? You will have contralateral hemiparesis because this corticospinal tract hasn't crossed yet. So you will have a contralateral hemiparesis. You will have weakness on the opposite side. So if you are looking at it from above, and this is the left side and this is the right side, then you will have, if there is a lesion here, then you will have right-sided hemiparesis, and you will have third cranial nerve palsy on the same side, because this is not going to cross. This has already left the brainstem, and so you will have cranial nerve 3 palsy on the left side. And this is called as Weber's syndrome. Okay, so what other kind of lesion can there be? There could be a lesion a little bit more posteriorly. So if there is a lesion, say, involving this area, now what will happen? So here you have involvement of corticospinal tract, and you also have involvement of your red nucleus. So here you will again have contralateral hemiparesis, and you also have your third cranial nerve involved. So you will have ipsilateral third cranial nerve involvement, and because of red nucleus, you will have tremor, because red nucleus has to do with involuntary control of your movement. So you can have tremor and you can have other involuntary movements. Now, what else can be there? You also have your superior cerebellar peduncle here, because remember I told you that your superior cerebellar peduncle, the fibers of your superior cerebellar peduncle, the superior cerebellar peduncle goes to your midbrain. So in the midbrain, the superior cerebellar peduncle is here. So if there is a lesion involving the superior cerebellar peduncle, then you can have ataxia. So you will have all of this. You can have corticospinal tract involvement, third cranial nerve involvement, and red nucleus involvement, and superior cerebellar peduncle. So you can have all of this plus ataxia. And this is known as Claude syndrome. Now, these are good for theoretical knowledge, but practically speaking, you should know that there is not much area difference between these different sites. And so it is very, very likely that something may start off as Weber and then go to Benedict or involve Claude. So there was a time when every new lesion had a different name because everybody was so excited to put their name onto things. But clinically speaking, the relevance is less because it is important to localize where is the lesion and why is the lesion. And if you localize the lesion that it is a midbrain lesion and it is dorsal or ventral, then that is good. You should move on to why is the lesion, what is the lesion. But for theory, it's great that you can know the difference between Weber, Benedict, and Claude. Somebody asked ataxia on which side? Ataxia is usually on the contralateral side. There is another syndrome called North-Nagel syndrome in which the ataxia is more on the ipsilateral side, but we won't go into that. This much is enough for midbrain strokes. Now moving on to pons. Now in the pons, you can have, there are two classical lesions that are associated with pons, two classical brainstem syndromes that are associated. One is called as Foveal and the other is known as Millard-Gubler. So what is the difference between these two? In one of them, you have a lesion in this area. Okay. So here what are the lesion, what are the areas involved? Your corticospinal tract, your sixth nerve, and your seventh nerve. So you can have contralateral hemiparesis, you can have ipsilateral facial palsy, and ipsilateral sixth nerve palsy. So in one side, your eye, your sixth nerve controls your lateral rectus. So your eye cannot look towards that side. Now in a foveal, so this is known as Millard-Gubler. Now in a foveal syndrome, what happens is that your lesion extends down and it actually involves a part of the sixth nucleus known as PPRF. Now, PPRF controls not only the sixth nucleus on that side, but it also controls the third cranial nerve on the opposite side. So if your sixth nucleus, if only your sixth nerve is gone, then your PPRF is spared. So your opposite third cranial nerve is working fine. But if your PPRF is gone, then not only is your sixth nerve gone on the same side, but your opposite third cranial nerve also doesn't work properly. So this leads to a gaze paralysis, not just a nerve paralysis. So in Foveal syndrome, you have trouble looking towards that side on both eyes. Whereas in Millard-Gubler, only that eye has a problem. The other eye is able to look to that side. Okay, so that is the main difference between these two. And of course, both of them will have contralateral hemiparesis and facial nerve. So that is same for both. And coming to medulla, there are two classical syndromes that are described with medullary infarcts. One is lateral and one is medial. Okay, so now this is anterior and this is posterior. Let's draw the pyramidal tracts. Now the pyramidal tracts are almost about to cross over. So this is just above the decussation. What else was there? You had your vagus, so your 10th nerve. You had your 12th nerve nucleus. Your 12th nerve leaves like this. Your vagus leaves like this. What else is there in the medulla? You also have your spinothalamic tract, and depending on whether they have crossed over or not, you can have either your posteriorly your posterior column, or if they have crossed over, then you have your medial lemniscus. Okay, what else is there in the medulla? You also have your sympathetic system. So I will take the sympathetic system on another class, but for now, just remember that your sympathetic tract is also there in the lateral part of the medulla, and you also have some nuclei known as nucleus tractus solitarius and nucleus ambiguous. So these are responsible for your throat function, so your swallowing, etc. So that is controlled by your nucleus tractus solitarius and nucleus ambiguous, and these are right next to your vagus nerve. So these three form sort of a very close connection. What else is there? You have your vestibular nucleus. Now let's look at the lesions. Supposing there is a medial stroke. What are the sites of involvement? You have your corticospinal tract, so that will lead to contralateral hemiparesis, assuming that they haven't crossed over yet. You have your 12th nucleus, so you have ipsilateral hypoglossal nerve problem, so that is your tongue involvement, and you can have your medial lemniscus. So the medial lemniscus contains fibers that have crossed over from the posterior column. So that means that they have already crossed over. So then if there is a lesion, it will be on the opposite side. So you will have contralateral posterior column involvement. Okay, so let's just revise. In your medial medullary strokes, the involved lesions are corticospinal tract, your 12th nerve nucleus or the 12th nerve fiber, and your medial lemniscus. So you can have contralateral hemiparesis, ipsilateral tongue involvement, and contralateral posterior column. All right, now that was the easy part. The medial medullary syndrome was the easy part. This is also known as Dejerine syndrome. Okay, now let's talk about lateral medullary and what are the different structures that could go in a lateral medullary syndrome. So now let's remove all this. And now the lesion is here. Okay. So here the different sites of involvement are, you can have your spinothalamic tract involved because that is lateral. You can have your vestibular nucleus involved. You can have your 10th nerve, you can have your 10th nerve involvement. Along with your 10th nerve, you also have the 9th nerve. So glossopharyngeal and vagus. You can have these two nuclei that I told you about, nucleus tractus solitarius and nucleus ambiguous. You can have the posterior column fibers involved. So those are known as fascicles of cuneatus and gracilis. So cuneatus and gracilis are the names of the posterior column fibers. Gracilis comes from your lower limbs and cuneatus comes from your upper limbs. So these are all the different fibers that can get involved in your lateral, if your lateral part of your medulla is involved. Now, what will be the effects of these? So if your spinothalamic tract is involved, your spinothalamic tract is an ascending fiber. It carries pain and temperature of the opposite side. So you will have contralateral loss of pain and temperature, and everything else will be ipsilateral. Okay. So only your pain and temperature will be lost on the opposite side. So if your left-sided medulla is gone on the lateral side, then you will have right-sided pain and temperature loss, and everything else will be on the same side. So your vestibular nucleus will be involved on the same side. So if your vestibular nucleus is involved, you will have nausea, vertigo, vomiting. Your 10th and 9th and 10th will be involved on the same side. So because of that, you can have your pharyngeal problems. So vocal cord palsy, difficulty in speaking, your uvula will shift, all of that. Your nucleus tractus solitarius and ambiguous will go. So you can have loss of taste from your pharynx. Because of loss of cuneatus and gracilis, you can have loss of vibration and position sense. Okay. But this will also be ipsilateral because they haven't crossed over yet. So everything will be ipsilateral except for your spinothalamic tract involvement. And another one that will be involved is your sympathetic tract. So you can have Horner's syndrome. And this I will discuss a little bit more in detail when we discuss our autonomic nervous system, because this deserves a separate discussion in itself. There is one more part that is involved, that is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. So that will cause ataxia, which will also be on the same side. In your lateral medullary syndrome, your fifth nerve, yes, your fifth nerve nucleus is also involved. So there is in your fifth nerve, there is something called as descending nucleus. And this is what supplies the sensations to your face. So in your brainstem, your fifth nerve actually extends from your pons down to your medulla, and this is the descending nucleus. And the sensory supply is something like, if this is your face, as you go up the fifth nerve nucleus, the sensory supply goes from outward to inward. So if there is a lesion in the medulla, there will be sensory loss outside. And now if there is a lesion above in the pons, the sensory loss will be closer to the center. So this is known as onion skin distribution. Okay, it's also called as balaclava. Balaclava pattern. So balaclava is the sort of like a head gear that you wear where your mouth is exposed, your eyes are exposed. So if there is an ascending lesion in the brainstem, your mouth will not be involved, but consecutively there will be increasing areas of involvement as you go out. Now, if there is a lateral medullary syndrome, then your descending fifth nerve nucleus is also involved. So you can have ipsilateral sensory loss, more towards the outside part. The important thing to remember is that one, what is not involved. So your corticospinal tract is spared because that is in the middle. Your 12th nerve is spared because that is in the middle. Everything else can get involved. Out of everything else, only your spinothalamic tract is on the opposite side. Everything else is ipsilateral. That is the rough outline of brainstem strokes. So we've covered the anatomy, we've covered what all are the structures, the tracts, the nuclei, and the cerebellar fibers. We've covered the blood circulation of the brainstem, and then we covered strokes and presenting features of each midbrain, pons, and medulla. Now, in each of these three areas, I've only covered the main examples of the strokes. In each one, there are several others, but discussing all of them will take a lot more time, and B, it sort of starts to get a little confusing. So if you want, we can take another lecture on brainstem stroke. So brainstem stroke part 2, where we discuss all the rest. But in that one, we won't have to cover all of these. So we'll just quickly revise this and then we can discuss all the others. Okay, so there are a lot of your lower cranial nerve syndromes. So we can discuss all of them, but it would get a little confusing if you take it all together in 1 hour. Okay, chalo, bye. Take care.